The challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. In last week's episode of Challenge 2.0, we began to examine the systemic theft of Native American artifacts and even in some cases, the bodies of their ancestors. We continue our conversation with Native American leaders today, examining a new law that opens the door to their reclaiming their sacred heritage and also what more steps are needed. So we are pleased again to welcome two wonderful guests that will give us the benefit of their perspective and their knowledge, their experience with these issues. Shannon O'Loughlin is the Executive Director and Attorney of the Association of American Indian Affairs and also a citizen of Choctaw Nation. Shannon, thanks so much for joining us again.
Thank you for having me again. Thank you.
And Jay Julius is the former chair and council member of Lummi Nation here in Washington State, and is an influential leader, speaker, advisor, and strategist who has been on this program before. And Jay, we're very thankful you're joining us again for this topic.
Great to be back, Jeff. Thank you.
In providing perhaps a little summary from last week's program and leading us into the discussion we're going to focus on this week, as we talk about the very different perspectives between nations and between collectors, has it been in your experience, and you might just summarize again that difference, your perspective on that, have you had the experience of someone who simply viewed these as artifacts, as collectibles, getting that mental shift in understanding your perspectives on this?
Well, I certainly have. What about you, Jay?
Yes, I've seen it, particularly with Western Washington University, where one particular site is the most studied site in Whatcom County since the 50s by Western Washington University. So yes, we have a great staff there and empathetic and part of our ceremonies, and we have seen a shift.
So that leads us to a law called NAGPRA. Shannon, I know you in particular were working and providing advice on the formulation of this. Can you tell us what NAGPRA is and what it does, and perhaps also what it doesn't do yet that it needs to do?
Right. So NAGPRA is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It is the first and only piece of human rights legislation that the U.S. has with tribes. So the very purpose of the law was to effectuate protection of graves, as well as repatriation of items that have been held by either federal agencies or institutions and entities that have received federal money. So the definition of what a museum is very broad under NAGPRA. And what it does is provides a legal process. So it's not a scientific experiment, it's not a research project, but is a simple administrative legal process by which institutions undertake to consult with tribes and then affiliate either the items or the ancestors with a tribe or tribes, and then return those back or repatriate those items and people back to their homes.
I might ask, does this allow you to recover all objects of significance, or are there still some areas that need to be addressed that aren't in the present law?
One of the main issues that we've had with the implementation of NAGPRA is that institutions are making the determinations under NAGPRA. And so oftentimes they have used processes outside of NAGPRA to delay repatriation. We know that of there's about 116,000 ancestors
Mm.
that have yet to be returned to their tribal nations. And these are just reported numbers. So
Mhm.
there's likely more than this, but institutions who have reported, there's about 116,000 that haven't been repatriated. About 98% of those have not even been affiliated. So that means that those institutions haven't done the process of NAGPRA. They have not consulted with tribes and worked towards affiliation and repatriation. So they're marked, those ancestors are labeled culturally unidentifiable,
Mm.
even though there's information with those ancestors that could repatriate those to particular tribes. So that's problematic, that the fact that the institution has so much power within the process. What's also problematic is that the items that are protected under NAGPRA are, it's a checkerboarded type scheme, and we could compare it to other federal laws such as the Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, the Eagle Protection Act. So if an eagle falls from the sky and lands on my private property, I'm absolutely prohibited from utilizing that animal for any purpose.
Mhm.
And federal law prohibits me from doing anything with that except calling the Forest Service and say, come pick up this eagle. But our ancestors, our cultural items that have been stolen from the entirety of Indian country is a checkerboarded scheme. So only federal and tribal lands, and only federal and institution hands. In other words, institutions that have received federal funds have to comply with NAGPRA. So that means the same ancestors, the same cultural objects, the same funerary objects that are held by a private person do not fall under NAGPRA's provisions.
Mhm.
So NAGPRA is not prohibitory. So there is still trafficking that occurs and looting that occurs on private lands without tribal consent because they're not tribal lands, they're not federal lands.
Have there been some groups or inspiration or institutions that have been more sensitive, more responsive that have observed as opposed to others?
Oh, yes. And some have been made to be more responsive. For example, in Michigan, the University of Michigan was a problematic institution
Mhm.
and would not repatriate. Out of that, a coalition of tribes in Michigan came together along with students at the University of Michigan and really pushed that institution to fulfill its NAGPRA requirements.
Mhm.
Other institutions have been more difficult. For example, the association recently called out Harvard Peabody Museum for its failure to follow NAGPRA. And they have approximately 7,000 ancestors in their collections in boxes. And in comparison, though this is kind of a harsh comparison, there's only approximately 100 Native American students who go to school on that campus. There are more
Mhm.
dead Indians at Harvard University than there are living Native people. And they have been a very difficult institution to deal with because their staff is embedded in practicing NAGPRA based on kind of a research model,
Mhm.
trying to protect its research interests of those ancestors and other cultural objects. And many tribes have had difficulties working with Harvard. One issue was that there's a provision of NAGPRA where if ancestors are labeled as unidentifiable, and as
Mhm.
I had mentioned before, either in the earlier show, that many institutions like Harvard have done that process wrong, where they have not consulted with tribes to try to determine what tribe those ancestors are affiliated with. Fortunately, the association's efforts with Harvard got Harvard to change their policy so that they have made an express change in their policy that they will look back and return those funerary objects that they've refused to do in the past and will do differently in the future.
Yeah, Burke's Museum at UW and even north of the border in Canada, many of our sacred objects, ancestors, Western Washington University, are stored in places like this. And development is somewhat the cause of all of this, and why we are where we are in terms of our funerary objects and ancestors in places that they are where they shouldn't be, being disrespected and not treated as sacred. For example, Western Washington University, I mentioned 45 WH1, which is at Cherry Point, Washington, where it's one of the most sought after last deep water ports where the US can export coal, oil, different things. And before fax machines, before Zoom, before internet, before cell phones, before an ear from the federal government with tribes, refineries were built. They didn't have a THPO department to go up and monitor as these refineries were being developed. So a lot of horrific things have taken place that many don't even know about. And those who were employed at the time, still struggle with the nightmares and the challenges of losing sleep and whatever else they go through from being a part of particular developments. So with Western Washington University and finally getting some of these sites listed as archaeological sites on the National Register, still many of these items remain in these institutions and universities. And I understand there's time needed, planning to repatriate through the Semiahmoo disturbance and what took place there. We have objects up at our cemetery now, but moving them, there's cultural challenges and cultural lines you don't cross.
Washington State generally is and the institutions within Washington State are much better than many institutions around the country. And so when you look at their record at repatriation and affiliation, which is the most important part, because affiliation means that you're working with the tribes, that you're consulting with tribes, and you are affiliating those ancestors so they can go back home. You see kind of across the board in Washington that about 96% of the ancestors and the institutions have been affiliated, and that the process is completed, meaning that there's federal register notices and such, even though repatriation may not have occurred yet. So there is Washington State and its institutions are much better than other states. For example, Massachusetts, Indiana, Illinois, and New York.
I have to say and give credit to some of the institutions in Western and some of the employees who have worked with our tribes and our cultural leaders and our elders for several decades. I do have to express here that I do have deep respect. They've been a part of our conducting of ceremonies, been present, have been asked by our cultural leaders to be present, because they do cultural work at those institutions, and I have to just state that I do have a lot of respect for those employees who have become friends of ours and work closely with our cultural leaders.
Given this mixed picture, does the fact that the Department of the Interior, for the first time, is now led by a Native American, do you anticipate, what is your personal reaction to that, I would ask, and do you anticipate that's going to help the overall situation?
Uh, well, it better. No. Yes. I do anticipate that we will see some positive responses from Department of Interior regarding these issues. I hope that she will be getting her divisions within the Department of Interior in line with NAGPRA, because federal agencies are also woefully out of compliance with their own federal law. And the issue that we've heard has been lack of funding and staff to help do that.
Jay, when you and I spoke initially, I know that you said that your experience with Cherry Point brought to the forefront a fundamental disconnect between what was needed in terms of analysis versus what the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers overall thrust and view of their mission is. Could you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Sure, they follow federal process, and Shannon knows all too well the federal process, the 106 process, which cultural sites treaty rights falls under in any development, especially large developments like the largest coal ports in North America being proposed. It's I get a question for you. How many permits has the Army Corps denied? And it's an interesting question. The Army Corps of Engineers isn't necessarily in the business to deny permits, it's to develop and engineer and create development. So it's the May 9th 2016 decision by the Army Corps to deny the permit for the proposed project was a rarity. But it was through, like I mentioned before, the chief walking the beach, and we. I'm gonna drift a little bit. We still wander off into a different world as Indigenous people. And I know this is said often, but not fully experienced. But we do have one step in the spirit world and one step in this world oftentimes. And sometimes, like I witnessed that day with the chief, we're able to take others into that world. And as they talked alone, it was an amazing moment because two eagles the entire time circled above them. And it's hard to create an understanding of where we come from when we come from two worlds and we're negotiating as partners or having a conversation as partners, trying to get our side of the story in cultural significance to particular properties across to an agency that is not designed to deny. They're designed to develop. The federal process it needs some help, and we need to, Shannon, Jeff, viewers, we need to move the 106 process and where we are acknowledged or recognized more to the front, because it makes it even tougher to, through an EIS process, through a federal process, to deny something when a proponent has millions invested, but that's the way it's designed. And it's backwards. Inherent rights, tangible and intangible, needs to be identified ahead of time.
What do you think needs to be done, and what can be done to lead to that change in attitude that matches the change in the law? Understanding that there are still further changes needed in the law itself.
Yeah. biggest area of work at the Association on American Indian Affairs has to do with public education.
Mhm.
Our organization has been around for almost 100 years now. Next year is our 100th anniversary. For the last 100 years, the organization has been focused on changing how our political system sees Native Americans, and has been successful at moving federal Indian policy from assimilation, termination, and genocide towards self-determination and sovereignty.
Mhm.
And unless we are teaching about Native Americans in our public schools, unless it's part of basic information that our congressional and federal and state leaders understand from day one, unless we can infuse more stories about Native American people in a good way in our education, I don't think things will change. We'll be constantly having to
Mhm.
explain and constantly facing this resistance. I think things are changing. I think the time and era we're in right now is one that we haven't had to face in a while.
Mm.
But Native Americans are still quiet. Our issues are not at the forefront as they should be, side by side with other groups who are facing racial and other issues.
I'd ask both of you to offer some suggestions as to what viewers, listeners can do to help, perhaps as donors to institutions, museums, and other roles that they might have. What could people do?
Well, one, I think support Shannon and Deb Holland in their efforts to create a Endangered Peoples or Endangered Cultures Act, or a revision to NAGPRA. Um, and I may be being a little sarcastic here, but Endangered Species Act can stop a project in its tracks. An Endangered Peoples Act or an Endangered Cultures Act, we really are in danger. I come from a fishing community. We are an endangered species. We are endangered fisher people who have since time immemorial fished, and now the salmon are disappearing. The orca
Mhm.
are going extinct. But I think supporting and encouraging policymakers to support, to right the wrongs of the past, and be vocal with your leadership wherever you are, and stand with.
And while our issues are similar to other peoples that have been marginalized, we're not a special interest group. We are sovereign nations
Mhm.
with a political and contracts with the United States. So we have a different standing in US history and in current politics. And what we add to the discussion and to the politic of the United States is expertise in science and tradition and working with the land and the environment and the animals and the
Mhm.
plants and the feathered and the fish and the things in the earth that most science is just now starting to understand. And you'll see that different US agencies are starting to learn from indigenous peoples about fire management,
Mhm.
about soil management, and other important environmental concepts and strategies. So we have a lot to bring to the table that has just never been listened to because of that kind of arrogant Western way of thinking and looking at indigenous peoples as inferior. I think it's important for everyone to look to the institutions that they have relationships with and know what their stance is as far as the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. To know where that university's lands are on, because often those university lands are on village and other native sites. And of course, there's many native tribes and organizations that can always use support and help with efforts of repatriation, and also working with auction houses and private collectors to
Mhm.
try to work towards agreements to have items come back.
There are so many points of discussion that I'd love to pursue, but I think I'd like to simply end by thanking both of you and expressing that I hope you'll come back and be a part of this program so we can further this discussion in some of the very interesting additional aspects that we talked about. And I think it goes without saying, but we'll say it nonetheless, that communication with elected officials or administrators can make a big difference. Again, thank you, Shannon, and thank you, Jay, so much for being a part of this program. And thank you, all of you that are watching. And we hope you'll watch us again next week on Challenge 2.0. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this program, found our conversations to be informative, entertaining, and thought-provoking, and the vision inspiring of people from different backgrounds who can disagree without being disagreeable, perhaps you might consider supporting our program with a contribution. Your support will not only help our program continue, it will also support the broader efforts of Paths to Understanding, our supporting parent nonprofit organization.